Unit 6. Individual Differences. Presentation 1. Definitions of abnormality.
In this unit, we will be taking a look at some of the different ways in which we determine whether or not a person's behaviour indicates an underlying psychological abnormality.
Defining abnormality is no easy matter, particularly as there is no one single characteristic that applies to all instances of abnormal behaviour. Possibly no single definition is adequate on its own. Each of the following definitions captures some aspect of what it really means to be abnormal.
Definition 1. Deviation from social norms. This is where an individual consistently behaves in a way that other members of society regard as inappropriate.
Societies are characterised by their social norms. These are the standards of acceptable behaviour that members of that society expect from each other.
For example, most societies have norms about how people should behave in public. Some of these norms are laid down formally in rules and laws, but others are more informal, such as norms relating to politeness, interpersonal and sexual behaviour and so on.
Does this mean that people who are rude or sexually promiscuous are considered abnormal?
Not necessarily. The sort of behaviour that is more likely to indicate abnormality would be if a person was inappropriately impolite or engaged in inappropriate sexual behaviour.
Such as someone who is always rude and aggressive towards passers-by, or who is sexually attracted to children.
Exactly. If someone behaves in this inappropriate way consistently, then they would be considered abnormal by other members of that society because they would be breaking social norms. Evaluating the social norms definition. A limitation of this definition of abnormality is that deviation from social norms doesn't necessarily indicate abnormality, but rather harmless eccentricity. If an individual dresses outrageously or is extremely rude when in company, this could indicate abnormality, but could also just be a sign of them being a bit eccentric. People who are eccentric are often referred to as being a bit weird, but we usually just mean they are different rather than mentally ill. Although eccentricity can be harmless, when it is extreme or disturbing to other people, we may begin to suspect some underlying psychological disorder.
That must make it very difficult to know when someone is actually suffering from a mental disorder and when they are just a bit odd.
Yes, that's exactly the problem, which is why this definition is rarely sufficient on its own if we must make a decision about whether that somebody needs treatment.
I see. Just because someone acts differently from everybody else doesn't actually mean they have anything wrong with them.
A second limitation of the deviation from social norms definition is that judging whether this indicates a possible underlying abnormality is dependent on the context of a behaviour. What we mean by this is that some behaviours are acceptable or normal in one situation, but not in another. For example, sitting in a corner crying may seem quite normal at a family funeral, but slightly bizarre at a student party. It is when we see behaviour that is completely out of place in a particular context that we may be tempted to judge it as abnormal. A final problem for this definition concerns the issue of cultural relativism. This is an important concept to consider when trying to understand abnormality, so let's stop for a minute and consider what it means. Definitions of abnormality are different in different cultures. In other words, any attempt to judge behaviour as abnormal would be pointless unless we also considered the culture in which this behaviour occurs. Something that might be considered a diagnosable disorder in one culture and therefore abnormal may be perfectly acceptable and normal in another culture. This means that there are no universal standards for defining abnormality.
Does this mean that a behaviour might be judged as indicating abnormality in one culture but not in another?
Essentially, yes. But let me give you an example to make this clear. Earlier, we used the example of crying at a funeral as an example of expected behaviour, therefore something that is within accepted social norms. However, in the UK, the excessive display of grief in public is generally considered inappropriate and may indicate an underlying disorder such as depression. In contrast, in some other cultures, crying at funerals is not just tolerated, it is required by custom, and the entire group of mourners may suddenly begin wailing loudly. In those cultures, such behaviour is normal, yet if this were repeated in the UK, it would not be seen as a normal way of behaving.
I see. So if someone from another culture started wailing loudly at a funeral in the UK, we might think they were mentally ill. But we would be wrong because where they come from it is quite normal.
Definition 2. Failure to function adequately. People with a psychological disorder often feel unable to cope with the demands of everyday living. For example, a person suffering from depression may find that their disorder makes it more and more difficult for them to go to work or college, or even take part in the social activities that they previously enjoyed. At this point, the person may label their behaviour as abnormal and seek help.
Other people might also label someone's behaviour as abnormal because they are not functioning adequately. For example, a mother may seek help for her daughter because she has disturbed eating habits.
Evaluating the failure to function adequately definition. Although this definition appears to make a great deal of sense, there remains the difficult problem of actually knowing when a behaviour reflects a failure to function for the individual and when it actually serves a valuable function for them.
So, as an example, if someone displays the symptoms of depression, such as not being able to enjoy pleasurable activities, this might represent a failure to function adequately.
However, if someone shows the symptoms of depression, this can also lead to increased social support from other people. As a result, this helps them deal with the stressor that led to the depression in the first place. In this case, a behaviour that appears to show a failure to function adequately ends up making the person function more adequately than they were before.
I see now. It's all to do with the word adequately, isn't it? Displaying abnormal behaviour could make it more likely that other people will want to help you, so you end up coping much better with their help than without it.
The issue of cultural relativism also applies to this definition. Judgments of what might be considered adequate functioning are different in different cultures. For example, if we have no friends, find it impossible to have a social life, and are unable to hold down a job, this would reflect a failure to function adequately in our culture. However, this might not be the case in another culture, where there are completely different expectations about adequate functioning.
This would mean that if we rely on a failure to function adequately criterion to decide whether someone is abnormal, then this could result in faulty diagnosis because we are using the standards of one culture to judge people from a different culture.
Definition 3. Deviation from ideal mental health. Our final definition concerns an individual's deviation from ideal mental health. In other words, the characteristics of somebody free from psychopathology. In the 1950s, psychologist Marie Yahoda identified 6 criteria that she believed defined ideal mental health. She proposed that the absence of any of these criteria would indicate the presence of abnormality. There is no need to know all 6 of these criteria, but an understanding of 2 or 3 gives us a flavour of what Yahoda means by ideal mental health.
The first criterion is having positive attitudes towards the self. For example, having a strong sense of identity and a positive self-esteem. In other words, feeling happy with who you are.
A second criterion is having an accurate perception of reality. That is, being able to see oneself and the world in a realistic way. People who are overly optimistic or pessimistic about life might not possess this criterion.
A third criterion is self-actualization. Self-actualization refers to the idea that a mentally healthy person should be motivated to fulfill their potential and develop fully as a person. We all have the potential to make something of ourselves, yet some people are prevented from achieving their potential, and mental health issues may arise as a result of this frustration.
Evaluating the deviation from ideal mental health definition. A limitation of this definition is that despite its focus on the positive characteristics of mental health, being able to meet all 6 of the criteria would be quite demanding. According to this definition, all of us would be abnormal to some degree, because it would be unusual to find people that satisfy all of these criteria all of the time. These criteria are undoubtedly ideal, but we might question how many have to be absent before a person would be judged abnormal.
As with all the definitions of abnormality we've discussed, the issue of cultural relativism also applies here. Most, if not all, of the criteria of Yehuda's ideal mental health definition are based on what might be considered ideal for Western, middle-class individuals. If we apply these criteria to other social groups, we will probably find a higher incidence of abnormality among those individuals. However, this might be simply due to the fact that we have used inappropriate criteria to judge their mental health.
For example, the idea of self-actualization is perhaps only relevant for members of advanced Western cultures, such as the UK, rather than for members of non-Western cultures, such as China. In these cultures, individuals may strive more for the greater good of the community than for self-centered goals, so an absence of self-actualization would have nothing to do with mental health. What can we conclude about definitions of abnormality? This presentation has given you some idea both of the different ways in which abnormality can be defined and also the tremendous difficulties in any attempt to define what is and what is not abnormal. As we suggested at the beginning of this presentation, perhaps the best definition is one that combines all the features of these 3 definitions.